why they didn't believe you. If you've ever tried to explain what happened to you, and someone responded with confusion, doubt, or worse, silence, you probably assumed the problem was you. You thought maybe you were exaggerating. Maybe you misunderstood. Maybe you were too emotional, too sensitive, too dramatic. But what if the reason no one believed you has nothing to do with your ability to explain, and everything to do with the nature of narcissistic abuse itself? A woman once said to me, "I felt more invisible after I left than while I was with him. At least inside the relationship, I understood what was happening. Outside of it, no one else did." And that sentence holds one of the most painful truths about emotional abuse. The world doesn't notice what leaves no visible marks. People believe what they can see. Narcissistic abuse is engineered to be felt, not seen. Manipulation happens quietly, emotionally, through subtle shifts in tone, silence, blame, withdrawal, guilt, charm, or affection that arrives only when you're about to break. There's no obvious villain, no dramatic scene, no clear evidence. Which means your suffering exists in a space most people don't know how to understand. And here's something deeper. Narcissists don't act the same way publicly as they do privately. They build personas: kind, charming, attentive, friendly. They appear supportive, caring, even generous. So when you tell someone what you lived, your story goes against the image everyone else believes is real. And most people choose the version of reality they've seen with their own eyes, not the one you experienced alone. That doesn't mean they're right. It means the abuse worked. Narcissistic abuse is designed to isolate you emotionally, not only while you're in IT, but also when you try to leave it behind. The silence you receive after escaping is actually an extension of the abuse, just expressed through the absence of understanding, rather than the presence of manipulation. But here's the part that cuts the deepest. Each time someone doubted you, a part of you doubted yourself. The external disbelief becomes internal confusion. And confusion is exactly what kept the cycle alive in the first place. So when people didn't believe you, you didn't just feel alone, you felt invisible inside your own reality. Stay with me, because in the next part, I'm going to explain why narcissists look so harmless from the outside, and why your suffering was designed to be hidden in plain sight. The mask that was never meant for you. One of the most confusing things about narcissistic abuse is this. The cruelty you lived and the kindness others saw came from the same person. It wasn't two different versions of him. It was one version carefully divided between private behavior and public performance. And that divide wasn't accidental. It was part of the design. Narcissists don't manipulate everyone. They manipulate the one person whose validation they need the most. They don't charm you because they love you, they charm the world, so that, when you finally speak, the world doubts you. That's how emotional power is protected. A woman once told me, "Everyone said he was such a good man, but I never met the man they were talking about." That sentence reveals the core of narcissistic dynamics. There's a public mask, tailored for admiration, and a private script, tailored for control. The mask is what the world receives. The script is what you survive. And here's a painful truth. The mask wasn't built for you. It was built for everyone else. You were never meant to see it. You were only meant to believe that other people saw him clearly. That way, when you eventually tried to speak about the abuse, the contrast between your truth and his appearance made you sound irrational. This contradiction isn't accidental. It's strategic. Narcissists master impression management. They choose careers that look respectable, hobbies that seem compassionate, friendships that make them appear trustworthy, and social behavior that signals emotional intelligence. Meanwhile, the private version uses silence, guilt, emotional withdrawal, and subtle punishment to keep you small enough not to leave. From the outside, he looks harmless. From the inside, he feels terrifying. That split reality creates what psychologists call image defense. The public persona becomes so socially convincing that your private pain becomes socially unbelievable. That's why you were not believed, not because your pain wasn't real, but because his mask was. And when the mask is convincing enough, your voice can sound exaggerated, dramatic, or even unstable, not because you are, but because the contrast between truth and illusion is too big for the listener to process. Most people assume abusers look dangerous. Narcissists look admirable. Most people assume victims look hurt. Survivors look confused. The roles don't visually match the expectation. So people choose the story that preserves their own comfort. It's easier to believe the nice guy than to believe pain that has no visible proof. But here's the part that matters. Just because they didn't see it doesn't mean it wasn't happening. It means he made sure they never would. In the next part, I'll show you why emotional abuse is designed to be invisible not only to others, but eventually even to yourself. Why emotional abuse is designed to be invisible. Emotional abuse rarely arrives in big dramatic moments. It arrives slowly, quietly, through emotional microcuts so small, you don't notice them happening until you're already bleeding on the inside. Narcissistic abuse isn't a hurricane, it's erosion. And erosion doesn't get attention until something finally collapses. People imagine abuse as yelling, threats, violence, obvious cruelty. But narcissistic abuse is built on subtle forms of control, a tone, a sigh, a silence that feels like abandonment, a question that makes you doubt yourself, a look that tells you you've disappointed him, a moment of affection that arrives too late, then disappears too quickly. These things leave no mark. How do you prove them? A woman said to me. One day I realized I couldn't explain why I felt terrified. Because nothing specific ever happened. That is exactly how the abuse is designed. No moment feels big enough to call abuse, but every moment together becomes heavy enough to crush your reality. Emotional abusers avoid extremes that would give you a clear reason to leave. They operate inside ambiguity. Ambiguity is the perfect trap. Never enough harm to justify walking away. Never enough safety to feel secure. Always just enough hope to keep you waiting for things to improve. When abuse is subtle, your nervous system becomes the evidence, but no one else can see it. So the world assumes everything is fine, while inside, you feel like you're emotionally suffocating. And suffocation that doesn't leave bruises is easy for others to ignore. This is why victims blame themselves. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe he's right. Maybe it's me. Self-doubt becomes part of the abuse. It keeps you quiet. It keeps you small. It keeps you unable to describe what's happening because you don't fully understand it yourself. That's the genius of narcissistic control. It convinces you to question your feelings instead of questioning the relationship. And here's something most survivors don't realize until much later. Emotional abuse is designed to not look like abuse even to you. If you could clearly see what was happening, you would leave. So the abuse makes itself invisible. The more invisible it becomes, the more trapped you feel. This invisibility is what makes the world disbelieve you, but it also makes you disbelieve yourself. And that internal disbelief is what keeps the trauma bond alive long after the relationship ends. In the next part, I'll explain the silent weapon that makes survivors look unstable. While the narcissist looks calm, the silent weapon that makes you look crazy and him look calm. There's a reason survivors often end up looking emotional, unstable, reactive, or overwhelmed while the narcissist appears calm, rational, and composed. And the painful irony is that this contrast makes the world assume he's the stable one. But this dynamic is not accidental. It's engineered. Narcissists don't explode, they provoke. They don't shout, they withdraw. They don't attack you emotionally. Bleed yourself trying to decode what their silence means. Their control isn't loud, it's quiet. And quiet manipulation forces you into emotional reaction, while they remain comfortably detached. A woman wrote to me, I looked hysterical trying to explain everything he did, and he just sat there calmly saying, see, that's exactly the problem. This tactic is one of the most common forms of psychological warfare in narcissistic abuse. Emotional provocation, followed by emotional detachment. He creates the emotional injury. You express the pain. He stays calm. You look distressed. The pattern repeats until your emotional expression becomes the evidence used against you. This is why survivors end up asking themselves, am I overreacting? Why can't I stay calm? Why does he seem fine? How am I the emotional one? Because emotional abuse isn't designed to make him angry, it's designed to destabilize you. When you react, he gets proof that the problem is you. And the more you try to explain, the more reactive you appear. The silence is the attack. Your reaction is the response. The world sees only the response. And here's the cruel twist. Calmness looks like innocence. Distress looks like guilt. So the very behavior caused by the abuse becomes the reason. No one believes the abuse happened. He stays composed because he isn't in pain, you are. He created the pain. He's watching it. He's feeding on it. Narcissistic control isn't about conflict, it's about imbalance. That imbalance makes you desperate for clarity, desperate for validation, desperate to prove what happened, because part of you knows that if you don't explain it perfectly, no one will believe you. And that desperation doesn't make you wrong, it makes you human. Emotional abuse demands expression. Silence is impossible when you are drowning. Your voice isn't hysteria. It's survival. But here's the part that matters. You weren't emotional because you were unstable. You were emotional because someone kept cutting your emotional foundation out from under you. He wasn't calm because he was secure. He was calm because he enjoyed watching you question yourself. And the world mistook detachment for innocence, because it doesn't understand that silence can be violence too. In the next part, I'll explain the most painful truth of all. Sometimes the people around you believed him more than you because he gave them a version of himself he never gave you. They believed him because he gave them what he never gave you. Here's something that hurts more than silence. When people you trusted defend the person who hurt you, friends, family, sometimes even therapists or spiritual mentors, they repeat things like, "He seems so nice," or "He never looked like someone who would do that." Or the most destructive sentence of all, "Are you sure you're not overthinking it?" Those sentences cut deeper than the abuse itself because they prove exactly how invisible your suffering has been. But here's the truth. They didn't see who he was. They saw who he needed them to see. A woman once said, "He treated strangers with more kindness than he ever gave me." That isn't hypocrisy, that's strategy. Narcissists give admiration to the world and take validation from you. They offer generosity to outsiders and demand emotional payment from insiders. They create distance where they don't need control and closeness where control can be maximized. That's why he treated you differently. You weren't chosen for kindness, you were chosen for power. The more emotionally open you were, the more useful you became to his ego. So when you try to explain what happened, you're not just fighting disbelief, fighting the identity he built for everyone else to trust. People prefer the version of him that benefits them, not the version that destroyed you. And here's the brutal reality. People believe the behavior they personally experience. They trust what they see, not what they don't. He was kind to them. He was cruel to you. Both things are true. But the world rarely accepts truth it didn't personally witness. And that's not a failure of your explanation, that's a failure of human perception. People don't believe emotionally abuse because emotional abuse doesn't ask for their attention. It hides in places no one else is looking. It happens behind closed doors, in the silence between sentences, in the tone shift that feels like threat only to the person who recognizes the pattern. When you finally speak up, you're speaking against an illusion built long before you tried to describe the reality. Illusion feels more believable than pain because illusion makes other people comfortable. Pain forces them to see what they don't want to see. So they chose comfort. You chose truth. And the choice cost you your voice. But here's what matters most. Just because they believed him doesn't mean they knew him. They knew the version he performed. You knew the version he protected. That makes your truth the real one. In the next part, I'll explain why this disbelief doesn't end when the relationship ends and why many survivors feel more alone after leaving than during the abuse. Why the loneliness gets worse after you leave. Most people assume the hardest part of narcissistic abuse is surviving the relationship itself. But survivors know something much more painful. The real loneliness begins after you leave. Because while you were inside the cycle, at least you understood the rules. Even if those rules hurt you. Once you're outside, the rules disappear, but the pain remains. And suddenly you have no way to explain what you lived. A woman told me, when I was with him, I felt trapped. But after I left, I felt invisible. That sentence reveals the second stage of trauma. Not the abuse itself, but the absence of recognition from the world. You finally escape, and instead of validation, you receive confusion, disbelief, or silence. Ironically, freedom brings isolation. Because no one around you understands the battle you just survived. They think leaving should fix everything. As if liberation equals healing. But leaving doesn't remove trauma, it exposes it. Outside the relationship, you are confronted with everything he trained you to ignore. Your fear, your emptiness, your confusion, your wounded soul. Inside the relationship, survival was familiar. Outside of it, survival feels directionless. You're surrounded by people yet emotionally Alone, because the story you lived exists in a language no one else speaks. You're living a trauma that others can't translate. So the world continues normally, while you are grieving something no one ever saw. This post-abuse loneliness happens because narcissistic relationships replace your reality with theirs. When the relationship ends, that version of reality collapses, and your identity collapses with it. Not permanently, but temporarily. And during that collapse, you feel abandoned by the world. Just like you were abandoned emotionally inside the relationship. This isn't coincidence. Narcissistic abuse disconnects you from others long before it disconnects you from them. The emotional isolation already existed, becomes visible only after you're alone. That's why survivors often say, "I don't know who I am without him, I don't know where I belong. No one understands what I went through," because leaving doesn't give you back your voice, it forces you to realize you lost it long ago. And here's the truth, very few people recognize you're not lonely because you're alone. You're lonely because the world doesn't speak the language of the pain you survived. But the moment your nervous system begins healing, something subtle shifts. Loneliness transforms into solitude. And solitude is where identity is rebuilt not through others, but through yourself. That shift begins gradually. It starts with silence, and silence is where the next part of your healing begins. The empty silence that feels like you lost yourself. After the shock, after the panic, after the first waves of withdrawal, something unexpected enters the room, a silence that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels empty, almost frightening, as if someone erased a part of you that you depended on, even if that part was destroying you. A woman shared something heartbreaking. When the chaos stopped, I felt like I lost my identity. I didn't know who I was without the constant emotional emergency. That's the truth millions live quietly. Narcissistic abuse becomes a full-time psychological occupation. You spend so many months managing someone else's moods, reactions, needs, crises, and punishments that your nervous system forgets how to exist without constant emotional stimulation. So when silence arrives, the nervous system feels abandoned not by him, but by the familiar pattern. You're not missing a person. You're missing the emotional world your body was trained to survive inside. That world felt dangerous, but it also felt predictable. Predictability, even painful predictability, is easier for the nervous system to adapt to than the unknown. This is why after leaving, many survivors say, "I feel empty. I feel numb. I don't know who I am now." You're not numb because you're broken. You're numb because your nervous system is shutting down the survival mode that once kept you alive. Survival mode doesn't turn off gently. It collapses, and collapse feels like emptiness. Silence becomes a mirror. And what you see first isn't pace, absence of the person you became in order to endure him. The version of you that watched every tone, every silence, every shift in his emotional weather, no longer has a job. That version begins to dissolve. That dissolution feels like grief. Not grief for him. Grief for the self you lost, trying to love him. And here's the most painful truth. Your identity didn't disappear, was consumed. Piece by piece. Moment by moment. Every apology you gave for something that wasn't your fault. Every time you adjusted your behavior. Every time you held your feelings to avoid punishment. Your identity wasn't lost accidentally. It was sacrificed for survival. Silence brings that truth to the surface. And when it does, emptiness becomes the space where identity begins to return. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Quietly. But here's the part that matters most. Emptiness is not the end of healing. It's the beginning of rediscovering who you were before survival became your personality. In the next part, I'll show you when your nervous system finally realizes the pain you carried was never yours to carry. The moment you realize the pain wasn't yours to carry, there comes a moment in recovery that feels almost unreal, not because it's dramatic, but because it's quiet. It arrives without warning, without ceremony. You're thinking about something ordinary. Your day, your plans, your next step, and suddenly, the emotional weight you've been carrying feels foreign, like it never belonged to you in the first place. A woman wrote to me, "One day I realized I was carrying pain that didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like I borrowed it from him." That realization isn't poetic, it's neurological. When you spend months or years trying to decode, fix, or stabilize someone else's emotional world, your nervous system internalizes their chaos, as if it were your responsibility. But here's the truth. The pain you felt wasn't yours. It was your reaction to someone else's wound. Narcissistic abuse plants suffering inside you, then steps back and watches you bleed from the injury they caused. And because the world doesn't see the wound, it assumes the bleeding is coming from something inside you. That's how self-blame becomes part of the trauma. The turning point is when your nervous system finally separates the source of the pain from the experience of the pain. You begin to understand that you didn't create this suffering, you simply survived it. And survival sometimes feels like ownership. But ownership isn't truth. This shift doesn't come from intellectual understanding. It comes from emotional exhaustion. Eventually, your body becomes too tired to keep absorbing blame, doubt, guilt, and responsibility for someone else's emotional dysfunction. The nervous system stops defending them. It stops defending the cycle. And slowly, it begins defending you. That's when something extraordinary happens. You stop feeling like the problem. You start noticing the pattern. And the moment you see the pattern, you stop believing the story. This realization is the beginning of emotional detachment. Not detachment from love, but detachment from responsibility. You stop trying to fix someone who enjoys being broken. You stop trying to earn peace from someone who profits from chaos. And the moment you stop trying, your nervous system finally breathes. Here's something most survivors don't know. He didn't wound you because you were weak. He wounded you because he saw strength he could drain. Narcissists don't target broken people, they break people. That's how the cycle survives. So when your nervous system stops carrying the blame, something powerful begins. The weight slowly shifts back to where it always belonged, not on your heart, but on the person who caused the injury. And when the weight leaves you, something else arrives: identity. In the next part, I'll show you how your nervous system begins rebuilding your identity from the inside out. Long before you consciously realize that healing has already started. You didn't survive him because you were weak. You survived because you were strong. There is a moment in healing when the entire narrative flips, because someone convinces you, but because your nervous system finally stops absorbing blame. Up until now, part of you believed you stayed because you were naive, insecure, or emotionally dependent. But what if the truth is the opposite? What if the only reason the cycle continued was because you were strong enough to keep holding it together? A woman wrote, "I thought I stayed because I didn't know how to leave. But now I realize I stayed because I kept trying to love someone who never intended to love me." This realization doesn't come from anger. It comes from clarity. The survival strategies you developed weren't signs of weakness. They were evidence of resilience. Think about this. Weak people don't endure emotional chaos. They shut down. They walk away at the first sign of pain. The only people who survive narcissistic relationships are those who have emotional depth, empathy, loyalty, and capacity for repair. Those are strengths, not flaws. And those strengths were used against you. Narcissists don't target broken people. They target people whose emotional strength they can feed on. You weren't chosen because you were weak. You were chosen because you were valuable, because you loved deeply, because you stayed loyal, because you tried, and because trying was your language of love. And here is the most painful twist. He didn't destroy your strength, he consumed it. Piece by piece. He fed on your compassion. He exploited your empathy. He depended on your willingness to fix what he kept breaking. That isn't weakness, that's capacity. And capacity is exactly what narcissists cannot generate on their own. This is why once the relationship ends, the exhaustion feels unbearable. You weren't exhausted from loving. You were exhausted from carrying both hearts. His emotional emptiness, his insecurity, his chaos, his wound. And your nervous system mistook that labor for love. Here's the truth. You didn't endure because you were afraid. You endured because you kept hoping. Hope is not weakness. Hope is survival. Hope is love. And love isn't something you should blame yourself for. The moment your nervous system realizes that your endurance was evidence of emotional strength, not proof of emotional dependence, the shame begins to release. And when shame releases, identity returns. This is the turning point. You didn't survive despite your strength. You survived because of it. And that shift is the beginning of self. In the next part, I'll close by showing you how this realization becomes the foundation for the next chapter of your emotional life, not based on surviving someone else, but finally choosing yourself. Being believed was never the point. Believing yourself is. There's a moment in every survivor's journey when the focus finally shifts. You stop replaying the conversations you had with other people, trying to prove what happened. You stop wishing someone had listened. You stop rehearsing the explanations you never got to finish. And slowly, something more powerful replaces the need to be believed. The ability to believe yourself. A woman told me, I kept waiting for someone to tell me I wasn't crazy, until one day I realized I no longer needed anyone to say it. That moment doesn't arrive because the world suddenly understands. It arrives because your nervous system finally stops asking for permission to know your own truth. Being believed was never the destination. Being witnessed by yourself was. The abuse tried to steal your perception, and disbelief tried to silence your voice. But here you are, giving both back to yourself piece by quiet piece, because survival wasn't the end of the story. Understanding is. Here's the deepest truth. Most people will never know what you lived. They weren't meant to. Your pain wasn't their lesson. It was yours. But that also means your freedom doesn't depend on their validation. It depends on your acceptance of what happened, of who you became trying to survive it, and of who you are now becoming because you finally stopped needing the world to understand. Believing yourself doesn't mean forgiving him. It means freeing you. And that freedom doesn't begin the moment they believe you, it begins the moment you believe your own experience without asking for permission. That is where healing truly starts. And here's the most important thing I can offer you before we close. You don't need the world to believe your story for your story to be real. It was real because you survived it. It was real because your nervous system still remembers. It was real because it changed you. And the fact that you are here means the cycle ended. Not on the outside, on the inside. You are not alone. You were never crazy. You were conditioned. And that conditioning is what you're finally breaking. CTA emocional. Não invasivo. Retenção. If this spoke to something deep inside you, stay here. The next video in this series explains how your nervous system detaches from the bond long before your mind understands why. You don't have to prove anything anymore. Not to them. Not to him. Not even to me. Just keep walking with me through this series. Your nervous system is already healing.